The harsh winds of the Utah Territory carried whispers across the desolate landscape in the autumn of 1857. Among the Red Rock canyons and endless stretches of sagebrush, the Pratt family had carved out their dominion far from the watchful eyes of Salt Lake City's religious hierarchy. Ezra Pratt, a man whose wealth rivaled that of Brigham Young himself, had commissioned the construction of a peculiar chapel nestled deep within a narrow canyon, accessible only by a treacherous mountain path. The structure stood like a dark sentinel against the crimson cliffs, its Gothic spires reaching toward the heavens in stark contrast to the simple, practical architecture favored by most Mormon settlements. Local craftsmen who had worked on the project spoke in hushed tones about the strange specifications Ezra had demanded. Underground chambers beneath the altar, walls lined with black stone imported from distant quarries, and windows of deep purple glass that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. Samuel Morrison, a traveling merchant from California, first noticed something amiss when he stopped at the small trading post of Cedar Hollow, the nearest settlement to the Pratt estate. The proprietor, a weathered man named Josiah Kemp, grew visibly uncomfortable when Samuel mentioned his intention to seek shelter at the Pratt compound for the night. "I'd advise against it, stranger," Josiah muttered, his eyes darting toward the mountains. "The Pratts, they keep to themselves, especially since they built that chapel of theirs." Samuel pressed for details, but Josiah merely shook his head and busied himself with arranging goods on his shelves. The other patrons in the store fell silent, their conversations dying like embers in cold wind. It was then that Samuel noticed the absence of something he'd grown accustomed to in Mormon territories, the warm sense of community that typically welcomed travelers. As evening approached, Samuel decided to make camp in the foothills rather than risk the mountain path in darkness. He built a small fire and settled in for the night, but sleep eluded him. Around midnight, a sound drifted down from the canyon above, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to echo off the stone walls. The words were indistinct, but the tone carried an unsettling quality that made his horses restless and his skin crawl. The chanting continued until dawn, accompanied occasionally by what sounded like the tolling of a bell, though no church bell should ring at such ungodly hours. When morning came, Samuel packed his belongings with unusual haste and decided to take the longer route around the mountains, abandoning his original plan to trade with the Pratt family. In the chapel itself, Ezra Pratt stood before an altar unlike any found in traditional Mormon worship. The black stone surface was carved with symbols that predated Christianity, symbols he had discovered in ancient texts acquired through his extensive travels and considerable wealth. His family, his wife Miriam, his 3 sons and 2 daughters knelt in the pews behind him, their faces pale in the flickering candlelight. "The Lord has shown us a different path," Ezra intoned, his voice echoing in the vaulted chamber. "A path that requires sacrifice, dedication, and absolute secrecy." His eldest son, Nathaniel, shifted uncomfortably. At 25, he had begun to question his father's increasingly radical interpretations of their faith. The rituals had grown darker over the past months, and the family's isolation from the broader Mormon community had become complete. "Father," Nathaniel ventured carefully, "perhaps we should seek counsel from the elders in Salt Lake City. These practices, they seem to stray from the teachings of Joseph Smith." Ezra's eyes flashed with anger, and he struck the altar with his fist. "Joseph Smith was merely the beginning. The revelations I have received go far beyond his limited understanding." "We are the chosen ones, Nathaniel. We will not be bound by the narrow minds of lesser men." A cold wind swept through the chapel, despite the closed doors and windows. The candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to move independently of their flames. Miriam Pratt pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her lips moving in what might have been prayer, though to which deity, even she was no longer certain. The family's isolation had begun innocently enough. Ezra had always been a man of strong convictions, and when conflicts arose with church leadership over matters of doctrine and authority, he had chosen to establish his own religious community. The chapel was to be their sanctuary, a place where they could worship according to his personal revelations without interference. But as the months passed and the rituals grew more elaborate, something had changed in the very atmosphere of the place. The servants who had once maintained the estate began to leave, claiming they heard voices in the night and saw shadows moving in empty rooms. Those who remained spoke only when necessary and crossed themselves when they thought no one was looking. A Catholic gesture that would have been scandalous in any Mormon household. Dr. William Hayes, the territorial physician who occasionally visited the remote settlements, had stopped coming to the Pratt estate altogether after his last visit in early summer. He had arrived to treat young Mary Pratt for a fever, but what he witnessed in the chapel's underground chambers had left him shaken and unwilling to speak of it, even to his closest confidants. The Pratt family completed their midnight ritual and filed out of the chapel in silence. In the underground chamber beneath the altar, something stirred in the darkness, something that had been awakened by months of increasingly desperate prayers and offerings. The wind continued to howl through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of sulfur and the faint echo of voices speaking in tongues that predated human civilization. 3 weeks later, Thomas Whitmore, a surveyor working for the territorial government, failed to return to his base camp after mapping the remote canyons east of Cedar Hollow. His assistant, Peter Collins, waited 2 days before riding to the nearest settlement for help, his hands trembling as he explained to Sheriff Marcus Webb that Whitmore had been heading toward the narrow canyon where the Pratt Chapel sat. Sheriff Webb organized a search party that included Peter Collins, 2 experienced trackers, and reluctantly, Josiah Kemp from the trading post. They followed Whitmore's trail easily enough. His horse's distinctive shoes left clear marks in the sandy soil, leading directly toward the Pratt Canyon. The trail ended abruptly at a cluster of boulders roughly half a mile from the chapel. Whitmore's horse was found grazing peacefully in a small meadow, its saddle and surveying equipment still in place, but of the man himself there was no trace. "A man doesn't just vanish," muttered Jake Harrison, one of the trackers, kneeling to examine the ground, "especially not without his horse showing signs of distress. Look at this animal. Calm as can be, well-fed, watered. If there'd been trouble, it would have bolted." The search party spent the remainder of the day combing the area, calling Whitmore's name until their voices echoed off the canyon walls. As evening approached, they made the decision to approach the Pratt Chapel directly. Sheriff Webb had been reluctant to involve the family, knowing their reputation for privacy, but a man's life was at stake. The chapel loomed before them as they climbed the narrow path, its dark stone seeming to absorb the fading daylight. No light showed in the windows, and an unnatural silence hung over the entire compound. Even the usual sounds of evening, birds settling for the night, the rustle of small animals in the brush, were absent. Sheriff Webb knocked firmly on the heavy wooden doors. After several minutes, they creaked open to reveal Ezra Pratt himself, dressed in black robes that seemed more suited to a medieval monastery than a Mormon settlement. His eyes, once sharp and intelligent, now held a fevered quality that made the sheriff instinctively step back. "Sheriff Webb," Ezra said, his voice carrying an odd, hollow quality. "What brings you to our sanctuary at this hour?" "We're looking for a missing man, Mr. Pratt. Thomas Whitmore, a government surveyor. His trail leads to this area." Ezra's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "I'm afraid we've seen no strangers, Sheriff. We keep to ourselves here, as you well know. Perhaps your surveyor lost his way in the canyons. It's easy enough to do." Behind Ezra, Sheriff Webb caught a glimpse of the chapel's interior. The space was dimly lit by candles, and he could see figures moving in the shadows, the rest of the Pratt family, he assumed. But something about their movement seemed wrong. Too fluid, too synchronized, as if they were performing some elaborate dance. "Mind if we take a look around?" Sheriff Webb asked. Though he phrased it as a request, his authority as a lawman gave it the weight of a demand. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Ezra replied, beginning to close the door. "We are in the middle of our evening devotions, sacred rituals that cannot be interrupted by worldly concerns." The door shut with a finality that left the search party standing in the gathering darkness. Jake Harrison spat into the dust and shook his head. "Something ain't right about this place, Sheriff. Haven't you noticed? No insects, no night sounds. Even the wind seems to avoid this canyon." A low moan echoed from somewhere within the chapel complex. It was a sound of such profound anguish that it made the horses shy and the men reach instinctively for their weapons. The moan was followed by what sounded like chanting, but in a language none of them recognized. "We should come back in the morning with more men," Peter Collins whispered, his face pale in the moonlight. "With proper authority." Sheriff Webb nodded reluctantly. As they made their way back down the treacherous path, none of them noticed the figure watching from the chapel's highest window. A figure that seemed to float rather than stand, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The next morning brought news of a second disappearance. Maria Santos, a Mexican woman who worked as a seamstress in Cedar Hollow, had vanished during the night. Her small adobe house showed no signs of struggle, but her bed had not been slept in, and her front door stood wide open. Most disturbing of all, her neighbors reported hearing her voice calling out in the darkness around midnight, calling from the direction of the mountains. She was saying something about La Capilla Maldita, reported her neighbor, an elderly woman named Rosa Gutierrez. The cursed chapel, over and over like she was being pulled toward it. Sheriff Webb felt a chill run down his spine. 2 disappearances in less than a week, both connected to the Pratt Chapel. He sent word to Salt Lake City, requesting assistance from the territorial authorities, but knew it would be days before help arrived. In the meantime, he posted notices warning travelers to avoid the canyon area and organized nightly patrols of the settlement. The disappearances continued. A traveling preacher named Reverend James Mitchell vanished on his way to establish a new congregation in a settlement beyond the mountains. A family of German immigrants, the Mullers, disappeared from their wagon train during a rest stop near Cedar Hollow. In each case, the missing person's belongings were found undisturbed, as if they had simply walked away from their lives without a backward glance. The pattern became clear to those brave enough to investigate. All of the disappearances occurred during the night, and all of the missing persons were last seen or heard heading toward the Pratt Canyon. The local population began to speak of the chapel in whispers, crossing themselves and avoiding even the mention of the Pratt name. Inside the chapel, the Pratt family continued their nightly rituals, but the ceremonies had evolved far beyond anything resembling traditional worship. The underground chamber beneath the altar had been expanded, its walls now lined with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the candlelight. The missing persons were not truly missing. They had become part of something far more sinister than mere disappearance. Nathaniel Pratt, his earlier doubts now transformed into horror, watched his father conduct the evening's ritual with growing desperation. The thing that had once been his mother stood beside the altar, her form still recognizable but somehow wrong, as if she were a poorly made copy of herself. His siblings too had changed, their eyes reflecting a hunger that had nothing to do with earthly needs. "Father," Nathaniel whispered during a break in the chanting, "what have we become?" Ezra turned to his eldest son, and Nathaniel saw that his father's humanity had been the first casualty of whatever force now inhabited the chapel. "We have become what we were always meant to be, my son, the chosen ones, the bridge between worlds." Elder Jonathan Kimball arrived in Cedar Hollow on a crisp October morning, his black carriage cutting through the desert landscape like a dark omen. As one of Brigham Young's most trusted advisors, he had been dispatched from Salt Lake City to investigate the growing reports of disappearances and the disturbing rumors surrounding the Pratt family chapel. His stern face, weathered by years of frontier life and religious responsibility, showed no emotion as he surveyed the fearful faces of the townspeople. Sheriff Webb met him at the trading post, grateful for the support, but apprehensive about the implications of church involvement. "Elder Kimball, I appreciate you coming personally. The situation has grown beyond what local law enforcement can handle." Kimball's piercing blue eyes studied the sheriff carefully. "Tell me everything, Sheriff Webb. Leave out no detail, no matter how strange it might seem." As Webb recounted the disappearances, the failed search attempts, and the increasingly bizarre behavior of the Pratt family, Kimball's expression grew darker. He had known Ezra Pratt for over a decade, had even considered him a friend and valuable member of the church community. The man Webb described bore little resemblance to the devout, if strong-willed Mormon he remembered. "There's something else," Webb added reluctantly. "Dr. Hayes finally agreed to speak with me about his last visit to the Pratt estate. What he told me, well, it's difficult to believe." Dr. William Hayes had been reluctant to break his professional confidentiality, but the mounting evidence of wrongdoing had finally compelled him to speak. He met with Elder Kimball and Sheriff Webb in the back room of the trading post, his hands shaking as he poured himself a generous measure of whiskey, a violation of Mormon doctrine that spoke to his level of distress. "I went there in July to treat young Mary Pratt for a fever," Dr. Hayes began, his voice barely above a whisper. "The girl was delirious, speaking in tongues I'd never heard before, but that wasn't the worst of it." He paused, taking another drink before continuing. "Ezra insisted I examine her in the chapel's underground chamber, said it was the only place where she felt comfortable. When I descended those stone steps, God help me, what I saw down there defied all reason." The doctor described a vast underground complex that seemed far larger than the chapel above could possibly contain. The walls were covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, and the air itself seemed thick with an oppressive presence that made breathing difficult. But most disturbing were the alcoves carved into the walls. Dozens of them, each containing what appeared to be a human figure in various states of transformation. "They weren't dead," Dr. Hayes whispered, his eyes wide with remembered horror. "But they weren't alive either, not in any way that made sense. They were aware, watching me, but their bodies were changing into something else." Elder Kimball leaned forward, his face grave. "Did you recognize any of these figures?" "Some of them. There was a traveling merchant who'd gone missing months earlier, a family of settlers. Others I didn't know, but their clothes suggested they'd been there for varying lengths of time. And in the center of it all was an altar made of black stone, covered in fresh blood." The revelation sent a chill through the room. Elder Kimball had dealt with apostates and religious extremists before, but nothing approaching this level of apparent corruption. He made the decision to confront Ezra Pratt directly, despite the obvious dangers. "I'll need a small group of trusted men," Kimball told Sheriff Webb. "Armed, but discreet. We cannot allow word of this to spread beyond our immediate circle until we understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." That evening, as the sun set behind the red cliffs, Elder Kimball led a party of 6 men up the treacherous path to the Pratt Chapel. In addition to Sheriff Webb and 2 deputies, the group included Jake Harrison, the experienced tracker, and 2 Mormon elders from Salt Lake City who had volunteered for the dangerous mission. The chapel appeared deserted as they approached, its windows dark and no smoke rising from the chimneys of the attached living quarters. But as they drew closer, they could hear the now familiar sound of chanting emanating from within the structure. The words were clearer now, and Elder Kimball recognized fragments of Latin mixed with something far older and more sinister. "Stay together," Kimball instructed quietly. Whatever we encounter in there, remember that these people were once our brothers and sisters in faith. If there's any chance of redemption, we must try to save them." The heavy wooden doors stood slightly ajar, as if inviting them inside. The interior of the chapel was lit by hundreds of candles, their flickering light creating a hellish atmosphere that bore no resemblance to any Mormon place of worship. The pews had been arranged in a circle around the altar, and in them sat the Pratt family, or what remained of them. Ezra Pratt stood at the altar, his arms raised toward the vaulted ceiling, his voice rising and falling in the alien chant. His wife Miriam and their children occupied the front pew, but their appearance was so changed that Elder Kimball barely recognized them. Their skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and their eyes reflected the candlelight like those of nocturnal animals. "Ezra Pratt," Elder Kimball called out, his voice echoing in the vaulted space. "In the name of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I command you to cease this blasphemy." The chanting stopped abruptly, and every head in the chapel turned toward the intruders. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the alien words had been. Ezra slowly lowered his arms and turned to face Elder Kimball, a smile spreading across his face that held no warmth or humanity. "Jonathan Kimball," Ezra said, his voice carrying an odd harmonic quality, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. "How good of you to join us. We've been expecting you. What have you done, Ezra? What has become of your family?" "We have been elevated," Ezra replied, beginning to walk down the aisle toward them. "We have transcended the limitations of mortal flesh and embraced our true destiny. The old ways, the narrow teachings of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, they were merely stepping stones to this greater truth." As Ezra approached, Elder Kimball could see that the man's transformation went beyond mere physical changes. There was something fundamentally wrong with his proportions, as if his body had been stretched and reshaped by forces that cared nothing for human anatomy. His fingers were too long, his limbs moved with an unnatural fluidity, and when he smiled, his teeth appeared to have been filed to sharp points. "Where are the missing people, Ezra?" Sheriff Webb demanded, his hand resting on his pistol. "What have you done with Thomas Whitmore and the others?" "They have been welcomed into our congregation," Ezra replied, gesturing toward a door that led to the underground chambers. "They have found a purpose greater than their small, mortal lives could ever have provided." The sound of movement from below confirmed Dr. Hayes's horrific account. Something was stirring in the depths beneath the chapel, something that had once been human, but was now serving a purpose that defied comprehension. Elder Kimball realized that they were facing something far beyond the scope of religious apostasy or even criminal behavior. The Pratt family had opened a door to something ancient and malevolent, and that door was still open, still drawing in victims to feed whatever lurked in the darkness below. "We're leaving," Kimball announced, backing toward the entrance. "All of us, now." But as they turned to flee, they discovered that the chapel doors had somehow closed and locked behind them. The candles began to flicker more violently, and the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. From the underground chambers came the sound of many feet climbing stone steps, and Elder Kimball realized that they were about to meet the fate of all the other visitors to the Pratt Chapel. The stone steps leading up from the underground chambers echoed with the sound of approaching footsteps, too many footsteps for the number of people who had disappeared. Elder Kimball and his men found themselves pressed against the locked chapel doors as the first of the transformed victims emerged into the candlelit sanctuary. Thomas Whitmore, the missing surveyor, was among the first to appear, but the man who climbed those steps bore only a passing resemblance to the person who had vanished weeks earlier. His body had been elongated, his limbs stretched to unnatural proportions, and his skin had taken on the same grayish pallor that marked the Pratt family. Most horrifying of all were his eyes. They held a terrible awareness, suggesting that some part of his original consciousness remained trapped within his transformed flesh. Behind him came Maria Santos, the seamstress, her small frame now towering and angular, her fingers extended into claw-like appendages that clicked against the stone as she moved. The German family, the Müllers, followed as a grotesque unit, their bodies fused together in ways that defied anatomical possibility while still maintaining their individual faces that pleaded silently for release from their nightmare existence. "My God," whispered one of the Mormon elders, his voice breaking. "What has been done to them?" Ezra Pratt laughed, a sound that contained harmonics no human throat should produce. "They have been perfected, Elder Kimball, freed from the limitations of their original forms and made into something greater. They serve a purpose now that transcends their petty mortal concerns." Sheriff Webb drew his pistol, but Elder Kimball stayed his hand. "Bullets won't help us here, Sheriff. This is beyond the realm of earthly law." The transformed victims arranged themselves in a circle around the trapped investigators, their movements synchronized as if controlled by a single will. Nathaniel Pratt, the only member of the family who still retained some semblance of his original appearance, stepped forward from among his transformed relatives. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his family's breathing, a wet, labored sound that suggested their respiratory systems had been fundamentally altered. "You have to understand, my father, he found something in those ancient texts. Something that promised power, promised revelation beyond anything Joseph Smith ever received." Elder Kimball studied the young man's face, seeing the torment there. "What did he find, Nathaniel? What force has taken hold of this place?" "It calls itself the Devourer of Boundaries," Nathaniel replied, tears streaming down his face. "It exists in the spaces between worlds, feeding on the essence of living beings and using their forms to anchor itself in our reality. My father thought he could control it, use it to establish a new religious order with himself as prophet." The truth began to crystallize in Elder Kimball's mind. Ezra Pratt, in his arrogance and hunger for spiritual authority, had made contact with something that existed beyond human comprehension. The chapel had become a feeding ground, and each victim had been transformed into a vessel for this entity's influence in the physical world. "The rituals," Elder Kimball said, understanding dawning. "You've been feeding it. Each person who disappears becomes part of its growing presence in our world." "Yes," Ezra confirmed, his voice now clearly emanating from multiple throats simultaneously. "And soon we will have enough vessels to expand beyond this isolated canyon. The settlements, the cities, all will become feeding grounds for our master's hunger." Dr. Hayes had been right about the underground chambers being larger than the chapel above could contain. The entity was warping space itself, creating a pocket dimension where it could store its growing collection of transformed humans. Each victim added to its power, and each transformation brought it closer to fully manifesting in the physical world. Jake Harrison, the tracker, had been quietly examining the chapel's interior while the others spoke. His frontier experience had taught him to look for escape routes in any dangerous situation, and he had noticed something the others had missed. A small window high in the chapel's wall, partially hidden behind hanging tapestries. "Elder," he whispered urgently, "there might be a way out, but we'd need a distraction." Elder Kimball nodded almost imperceptibly, then stepped forward to address Ezra directly. "You speak of transcendence, Ezra. But what I see here is corruption. These people haven't been elevated, they've been enslaved. Is this truly the religious vision you sought?" For a moment, something flickered in Ezra's eyes, a trace of the man he had once been. I wanted to bring truth to the world, to establish a covenant that would surpass all others. But the hunger, it grows stronger each day. It demands more. "It's not too late," Elder Kimball pressed, hoping to reach whatever remained of Ezra's humanity. The power you've unleashed can be contained, sent back to whatever realm it came from. But you have to help us." The moment of doubt passed, and Ezra's expression hardened. "There is no going back, old friend. The transformation is irreversible. Soon you too will understand the glory of serving a power greater than any earthly authority." The transformed victims began to close in on the trapped investigators. Their movements were fluid and predatory, and Elder Kimball realized that their time for escape was rapidly running out. "Now!" he shouted to Jake Harrison. The tracker had been ready. Using his rifle butt, he smashed one of the chapel's ornate candlestands, sending burning wax and flame across the wooden pews. The fire spread quickly in the dry mountain air, and the sudden chaos provided the distraction they needed. Jake boosted Sheriff Webb toward the high window, while Elder Kimball and the others fought to keep the transformed creatures at bay. The beings seemed reluctant to approach the flames, suggesting that fire might be one of the few things that could harm them in their altered state. One by one, the investigators squeezed through the narrow window and dropped to the rocky ground outside. Elder Kimball was the last to escape, and as he pulled himself through the opening, he heard Ezra Pratt's voice rising in a howl of rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the chapel. "You cannot escape what is coming!" Ezra screamed. "The boundaries are weakening. Soon our master will have no need for this isolated sanctuary." The men ran down the treacherous mountain path as the chapel burned behind them, the flames visible for miles across the desert landscape. But even as they reached safety, Elder Kimball knew that their ordeal was far from over. The entity that had taken hold of the Pratt family was still alive, still growing in power, and the fire would only delay its plans, not destroy them. In the distance, as the investigators made their way back to Cedar Hollow, they could hear something that chilled them to the bone, the sound of laughter echoing across the desert, laughter that came from too many throats and promised that this was merely the end of the first phase of a much larger and more terrifying plan. 3 days after the chapel fire, Elder Kimball stood in the telegraph office in Cedar Hollow, composing what might be the most important message of his life. The words he sent to Salt Lake City were carefully chosen, coded in language that would convey the urgency of the situation without causing widespread panic among the Mormon population. The response came within hours, signed by Brigham Young himself, promising immediate intervention with military support and instructions to maintain quarantine of the affected area. But even as help was on the way, the situation in Cedar Hollow continued to deteriorate. The chapel fire had not destroyed the entity, it had merely forced it to adapt. Without its primary sanctuary, the devourer of boundaries began to manifest in new and more terrifying ways. Dr. Hayes was the first to notice the changes. Patients began arriving at his makeshift clinic with symptoms he had never encountered, rapid physical deterioration, accompanied by an unnatural awareness, as if something else was looking out through their eyes. The affected individuals spoke of dreams, filled with impossible geometries, and voices calling them toward the burned ruins of the chapel. "It's spreading," Dr. Hayes reported to Elder Kimball during an emergency meeting. "Whatever that thing is, it's no longer confined to the Pratt family or their victims. It's reaching out, trying to establish new anchor points in our reality." Sheriff Webb had organized patrols around the settlement, but his men reported increasingly disturbing encounters. Shadows moved independently of their sources. Voices called from empty buildings, and several deputies claimed to have seen figures walking through the desert at night. Figures that appeared human from a distance, but moved with the same unnatural fluidity that had marked the transformed Pratt family. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Nathaniel Pratt, the only family member who had retained some measure of his humanity, appeared at the settlement's edge on the 4th night after the fire. His appearance was shocking. His body showed signs of the same transformation affecting the others, but his eyes still held intelligence and desperate hope. "I escaped during the fire," he gasped, collapsing into Elder Kimball's arms. "The entity, It's weakened, but not destroyed. It's trying to rebuild, to find new vessels. But there's a way to stop it. Nathaniel revealed that his father's research had included not just the rituals that summoned the entity, but also ancient texts describing how such beings could be banished. The process required specific conditions, a convergence of spiritual authority, physical sacrifice, and most importantly, the willing cooperation of someone who had been touched by the entity's power but retained their humanity. The boundary between worlds is thinnest at the chapel site, Nathaniel explained, his voice growing weaker as the transformation continued to claim his body. If we can perform the banishment ritual there, we can force it back to its own realm and seal the passage permanently. Elder Kimball studied the young man's deteriorating condition. What would such a ritual require? Blood freely given by one who has been marked by the entity, Nathaniel replied, and the combined spiritual authority of the church's highest representatives. The entity feeds on unwilling victims, but a willing sacrifice disrupts its power. The arrival of Brigham Young and his special counsel 2 days later brought both hope and additional complications. The Mormon leader, accompanied by 12 of the church's most senior elders and a company of territorial militia, established a command post in Cedar Hollow and immediately began planning their assault on the supernatural threat. "This goes beyond religious doctrine," Brigham Young declared during a private meeting with Elder Kimball. "If what you've described is accurate, we're facing something that threatens the very fabric of reality in this region. The banishment ritual required careful preparation. Ancient texts were consulted, protective circles were drawn using blessed salt and iron, and the militia established a perimeter around the burned chapel site. As the sun set on what they hoped would be the final confrontation, the assembled force made their way up the mountain path. The chapel ruins presented a scene from a nightmare. The fire had consumed the wooden elements of the structure, but the black stone altar remained intact, and around it, the ground itself seemed to writhe and pulse with unnatural life. The air above the ruins shimmered like heat waves, but the temperature was bitterly cold. "It knows we're here," Nathaniel whispered, his transformation now so advanced that his words were barely comprehensible. "It's gathering its strength for one final attempt to break through completely." The transformed victims of the entity began to emerge from hidden crevices in the canyon walls. Thomas Whitmore, Maria Santos, the Muller family, and dozens of others, all twisted into forms that served the devourer of boundaries. But their movements were sluggish, uncertain, as if the entity's control over them was weakening. Ezra Pratt appeared last, his form now so altered that he was barely recognizable as human. He had become something like a living conduit for the entity's power, his body stretched and warped into a configuration that hurt to look at directly. "You cannot stop what has already begun," he said, his voice echoing from multiple dimensions simultaneously. "The boundaries weaken with each passing moment. Soon all realities will be one, and all will serve the eternal hunger." Brigham Young stepped forward, flanked by his 12 elders, their voices rising in unison as they began the banishment ritual. The words were a mixture of Mormon doctrine, ancient Hebrew prayers, and formulas taken from texts that predated Christianity. The effect was immediate. The writhing ground around the altar began to still, and the transformed victims swayed as if fighting against invisible chains. But the entity was not passive in its defense. The air itself seemed to thicken, making breathing difficult, and several of the militiamen collapsed as the alien presence pressed against their minds. The temperature dropped so rapidly that frost began to form on the rocks, and the stars above seemed to dim, as if something vast was passing between them and the earth. "Now, Nathaniel!" Elder Kimball shouted over the rising wind. The young man stumbled forward, his transformed body barely able to support his weight. With tremendous effort, he reached the black stone altar and placed his hands upon its surface. The moment his flesh touched the stone, his blood began to flow freely, not from any wound, but as if the entity was drawing it directly from his veins. "I give this freely," Nathaniel gasped, his voice carrying across the canyon despite its weakness. "Not in service to your hunger, but in defiance of it. I choose my own fate." The effect was catastrophic for the entity. The willing sacrifice disrupted its control over the transformed victims, and one by one they began to collapse as their borrowed life force was drawn back into the dimensional rift. Ezra Pratt's scream of rage and despair echoed across multiple realities as his master's grip on the physical world began to slip. The banishment ritual reached its climax as Brigham Young and his elders completed the final incantations. The air above the altar tore open like fabric, revealing a glimpse of the alien realm from which the devourer of boundaries had emerged. The entity's true form was briefly visible, a writhing mass of hunger and malevolence that existed in too many dimensions for human eyes to fully comprehend. With a sound like reality itself tearing, the rift collapsed, taking with it the entity and all traces of its influence. The transformed victims crumbled to dust, finally released from their torment, and the unnatural cold that had gripped the canyon gave way to the normal desert night. Nathaniel Pratt died as the ritual concluded, his sacrifice having saved not just the Utah Territory, but potentially the entire world from an invasion by forces beyond human understanding. His body, finally free from the entity's influence, appeared peaceful in death, the first peace he had known since his father's misguided experiments began. In the weeks that followed, the official records would describe the incident as a case of religious extremism that had resulted in multiple deaths and the destruction of an illegal chapel. The truth was buried in the church's most secret archives, known only to a handful of senior leaders who understood the importance of keeping such knowledge from the general population. Cedar Hollow gradually returned to normal, though the settlement was eventually abandoned as the railroad chose a different route through the territory. The canyon where the Pratt Chapel had stood was declared off-limits, and over time, the desert reclaimed the area, erasing most physical evidence of what had transpired there. Elder Kimball returned to Salt Lake City a changed man, carrying with him the knowledge that reality was far more fragile than most people realized. He spent his remaining years quietly researching similar incidents, establishing a secret network within the church dedicated to monitoring and containing supernatural threats. The devourer of boundaries was gone, banished back to its own realm. But Elder Kimball knew that it was not the only such entity that might seek to cross into the human world. The price of maintaining the boundaries between realities was eternal vigilance, and the sacrifice of those brave enough to stand against forces that defied all human understanding. The desert wind carried away the last traces of the horror that had briefly threatened to consume everything. But in the deepest archives of the Mormon Church, carefully preserved documents told the true story of the Pratt family chapel. A warning for future generations about the dangers of seeking power beyond human comprehension, and a testament to the courage of those who had given everything to preserve the world from an unthinkable fate. The chapel was gone, the entity banished, but the memory of what had transpired in that isolated canyon would serve as a reminder that some doors should never be opened and some hungers should